This is the 35th episode of Methodically Processing Systems. 36th if you include episode 0, which was the pilot episode about toothbrushes. Now, my thanks to everyone who has supported the show all these years, and those of you who have shown your support in the last few weeks. Thanks to you, we're going to be telling stories about systems for a lot longer. Now, with the holidays, we thought it would be fun to do something for you all. If you're listening to this episode, follow the link in the episode description to the System Wisdom PDF and audiobook, and then use the code MPS all lowercase, when you check out to get the PDF and audiobook completely free of charge. Now, the code will only work for a limited number of people, so you better get on it quick, and good luck to you. Now, with that said, let's get to the next episode. Welcome to Methodically Processing Systems. Now, I know you're a nice person, but let's imagine you wanted to profit off of someone else's failure. Suppose you had to bet against them. How would you find your unsuspecting person to bet against? What kind of qualities or things would you look for in this person? What kind of characteristics or behaviors would make you think, this person is going to fail pretty soon, so I better bet against them? Some of you listening to this might look for someone who doesn't seem to be too smart. Others of you might be looking for someone that seems unlikable. Because after all, if you're going to bet against someone, why not bet against someone that you don't like? After all, you can probably reason that someone who isn't intelligent or someone who isn't likable is doomed to failure, right? It's possible, but that's not who I would look for. I know plenty of people who aren't that bright, who seem to dodge failure after failure, and I know plenty of jerks who do quite well. If I wanted to bet on someone's failure, I'd find the person who is rigidly planning something. The kind of person who has a well thought out, hard and complicated long-term plan. In my experience, it's the best way to find a failure long before anyone else can even fathom failure. The rigid planner is a very particular kind of animal. It's an animal that lives almost entirely in its own head, calculating, mulling, stewing, ruminating, plotting, scheming, day after day. Not to say that the rigid planner is an asocial creature. Far from it. The rigid planner can be very friendly and outgoing. But what makes them rigid planners is that they have it all figured out in their head. At least, they think they do. They're the kind of person who plans an entire argument in their head. They script things out to the finest level of detail. They take delight and comfort in having parsed out and solved the tiniest elements in their plan. And then, the moment the slightest detail falls out of alignment, they and their plan fall apart. You see, when you plan against a model of reality. What's a model? Well, a model is just a representation of reality. There is reality, the actual world, in all its detail, and the model is just the mapping of that reality. It's like the difference between your hand and your attempt to draw your hand. No matter how great you get at drawing, your drawing of your hand will never be your hand. It may look very close from one angle, but it's a flat drawing on a piece of paper. Your hand is flesh and blood in three-dimensional space. It cannot be captured in its totality by any drawing. Your hand can be open one moment, pointing a finger in another, and clenched into a fist in yet another. The drawing is forever what you originally set to paper. So why do you have to plan against a model of reality? Well, there's a funny thing called time. Time has three components: a past, a present, and a future. When you plan for the future. So you're planning against something that hasn't happened yet. And this pesky future thing is not real until it becomes the present, by which time it's too late to plan. So you can't plan for the future. Instead, you plan for a model of the future, what you think the future will be. It's like drawing a picture of a specific hand you've never seen before. You can roughly draw that hand, but until you see it in its full detail, you won't know what you really need to draw. You won't know if you'll be drawing a man's hand or a woman's hand, a closed hand or an open hand, a hand with fine fingers or chunky fingers. It's the same thing with the future. Chances are it's going to resemble today in some respects, but it could also be very different from what you're expecting. If your plan relies on rigid details and assumptions, and those details and assumptions don't pan out, your entire plan goes up in smoke. A rigid planner is generally a very smart person. They're detail-oriented, but they have just one big problem. They assume that the future will look like the present. They assume that all the details of tomorrow will be similar to the details of the now. Rigid planners assume a lot of things. When you see the world as static and frozen, it's easy to make assumptions. You can't imagine the ground slipping from right under you, so everything is assumed to be solid. Now, before we go and look too far down at rigid planners, it's worth mentioning that all of us are liable to fall victim to making big assumptions, and assuming that our assumptions are reality. For example, remember when I was talking about drawing a hand? Now, you're a pretty smart person, and because you listen to this podcast, you might even be a wiser person than most. Now, you probably assumed that a hand has to have 5 fingers. A hand could have none. A hand could have 7 fingers on it. It could be the hand of a man who survived being burnt and disfigured in a fire, so instead of fingers you have melted stubs. It could be a disfigured hand. It could be a beautiful hand. It could be a hand that is a mechanical prosthetic that looks really cool and has mechanical functionality. It could be the hand of a very hirsute woman with very long fingernails. That's the funny thing with assumptions. You don't realize they're wrong until reality slams into you. Okay, so we know we can find rigid planners by looking for people who think a model of reality is the same thing as reality. The kind of person who confuses a drawing of a hand for a real hand. What else can help us find these people so that we can bet against them and then profit? Say you wanted to go camping with your friends in about a month. If one of your friends is a rigid planner, they'll get excited about the camping trip and start getting into the details of their model of what the camping trip will look like a month from now. They'll start getting immersed in all the details that are relevant to their model of reality. Who will cook what? Who will bring what? How many sporks will you need? How many tents will you need? Who's going to bring toilet paper? Who's going to make the fire? Are you going to have marshmallows for s'mores? Do you need to bring kindling materials? How many cars will you need? Where is the campsite going to be? Which trails are you going to hike while you're on your trip? And actually, all of that is great. Having a detailed plan is a really helpful thing to have. But here is how you separate someone who is a rigid planner from someone who just happens to be detail-oriented. The rigid planner shows their prowess at planning every little detail, but only when it comes to their model of reality. The one thing that they don't account for is, what if their model of reality is wrong? What if the camping trip that they're envisioning doesn't actually happen? What if there's a hurricane or flooding? What if the people who are going camping get food poisoning and can't go? What if the campground is closed? All of their plans evaporate in an instant the moment the model changes. Their model of reality might just have accounted for a sunny day, so just a few drops of rain can completely destroy their model of reality and all the planning that goes along with it. You know, the engineers of the Titanic were very good, detail-oriented, but rigid planners. They thought through every detail of everything in their model of reality, so they were supremely confident that the Titanic was unsinkable, as long as everything went according to the exquisite details of their model of reality. But no model can ever capture the completeness of reality, any more than the most perfect drawing of a hand can become a real-world, living, breathing, three-dimensional hand. Now, sometimes the rigid planners survive their failed plans. It happens more often than you think. And when they do, they start to fool themselves into thinking that they just need to have a more detailed and even more complicated plan next time. If the rain foiled their camping trip last time, next time they'll have detailed plans for rain. But then they end up getting food poisoning and can't go camping. Now, as I mentioned, it's not the attention to detail that makes rigid planners susceptible to failure. Detailed plans aren't bad, but detailed plans can put a rigid planner into a strange, trance-like state. Something about the way our brains work makes us feel like the more detail and complication we have in our plan, the more likely that it is to be a good, true plan that models reality really well. It's the same reason that a story or movie filled with a lot of detail feels more realistic and authentic. But just because you have detail doesn't mean you can be rigid. And it's the rigidity of the plan that becomes problematic, not the details. Detailed plans give you a false sense of security in the model of your reality. They make you believe that your model is reality. There are artists out there who can draw a hand on a canvas that from certain perspectives can look exactly like a real hand. But just because it looks real doesn't mean that it is real. That's why if you want to profit off of someone else's failure, you should find someone who has a very detailed and complicated plan. So detailed and so rich that even you might be tempted to think that, boy, they've really thought through everything. Once you've found a few of these complicated plans, find the ones that look to be the most rigid. See how inflexible the plans are. If their plan is inflexible, it shows you that the plan is vulnerable to the smallest assumptions being wrong. No matter how realistic their model of reality looks, something that they didn't consider will eventually bring everything crashing down. And here's the thing. Because the detailed and complicated plan look so attractive and so well thought out to everyone surrounding this person, you might actually even have an audience around them that you can profit off of as well, because they're going to be betting in favor of that plan. So now you've got a multiplier for your profits. You can bet against the person with the rigid and complicated plan, and also everyone else who has been suckered into thinking that the plan, because it's complicated and rigid, is realistic and well thought out. So you can basically bet against the fool and everyone's suckered in by the fool and make a lot of profit. Unfortunately, not many people are able to draw up very detailed plans without being suckered into the rigidity that comes along with it. That rigidity that comes from thinking that because you have a detailed plan, you have an accurate and realistic model of reality, that you have somehow managed to predict the future, in effect. Now, what if you're the person who has to do the planning? How do you put together a well thought out, detailed plan without it being inflexible, without it being too rigid? And how do you make sure that you're not suckering yourself into thinking that your model is reality? In other words, how do you make sure that people who listen to this podcast don't end up betting against you? The simple answer is, you don't want to have the most accurate model of reality to plan against. You want to be able to plan against as many models of reality as possible. And in the next episode, we'll talk about just how you can do that. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving us a good review on iTunes.